I'm Joanne. This is the Turtle Stack, where I talk with guests about topics they love, even though I don't know much about it. We use 2 guidelines, no slamming, no selling. So we do our best to keep focused on the positive instead of tearing something down and without pushing agendas. We just want to focus on having an open mind to something new and building up the things we enjoy. Let's get into it. So this week I am here with Joseph. Joseph has his own podcast called Bulldogs and Dragons, Milestone Academy. It is very good. You should give it a listen for sure. But what are we going to be talking about today, Joseph?
We're going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons, D&D.
Excellent. So this is another topic that I do have some familiarity with. I do tabletop role-playing. It's been years since I played Dungeons and Dragons specifically. But for our listeners, what is Dungeons and Dragons?
So at its base, I've heard this described very well as a cooperative storytelling experience, and I think that's really what it is. You sort of all create this world and these characters that use dice to decide whether or not things succeed or not, and the dice give you a good limitation and sort of make things random, whereas opposed to just saying, yes, I do explode that goblin's head, and it happens.
Which is kind of a big part of it, because when you're a kid, you play imagination games, and whatever you want to do, you're always successful at, because you just say, nuh-uh, I shot you first.
Yeah, exactly.
But D&D has rules in play to kind of help determine those things, so that you're not always just winning or losing. You're seeing your struggles play through, depending on how the dice allow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I did mention your podcast at the beginning, which is a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. Do you want to share a little bit about how you came to start that? I
came to start it. It kind of started on accident. At my university, I was actually trying to start a club for Dungeons and Dragons, and that sort of didn't end out that well because it turns out you have to have a staff advisor, which was surprisingly hard to find someone who was willing to, spend their free time overseeing games of Dungeons and Dragons. But in the process, I'm in another club called the Blended Arts Club, and they sort of were meeting, and they were like, okay, guys, we don't have any projects to take on. And I just sort of like slapdash was like, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts where they play Dungeons and Dragons. What about one of those? And everyone was like super supportive about it. And they're like, yeah, let's do that. And I was like, oh, really? And so they just sort of like started getting all the equipment, and we looked for people, and that's sort of how I got started. The whole story behind the podcast, like in actual lore, is that basically there's this academy called the Milestone Academy, and it's very much a college parody. You know, there's like devils who offer loan plans, and like all the classes are actually people's majors, and people barely ever actually get time to long rest, just things like that. And yeah, and so it's sort of like just college setting, and like based off like a lot of shows I've seen of like a little like academies where students have to train to fight, and the whole world sort of revolves, and like the whole idea started with the academy and sort of grew out and like started that's how I started like expanding into writing other lore for it,
which I like. That's one of the things that I absolutely love about Dungeons and Dragons is it doesn't have to always be that same epic adventure that you see play through. You can make your own stories, and you can take those concepts and put them in different settings, and you're in charge of the story you want.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing this podcast, though, was not your first experience with D&D.
No, actually, my first experience with D&D was watching Critical Role, actually. I think that's how a lot of people got into D&D. My first time playing was I was on Discord, and there was this group for a game I have where it's basically just like a virtual tabletop called Tabletop Simulator, and D&D is really popular on it. So like I got into a game through there, and I sort of got to make like my first character, which was very much based off of like one of the characters in the Critical Role thing. Just like I liked seeing like the way they use their abilities, and I was like, whoa, all these things are cool, and I really wanted to try them out. So I sort of just made the character and got to have my first taste of D&D.
Excellent. Like, do you have like a favorite thing about D&D, like something that draws you to it more than other hobbies or other types of games?
There's a lot of things I like about D&D, but I think my favorite is probably the immersion aspect. I think like you could be like sitting in your friend's living room like playing D&D over like a really big table with snacks, but like in your mind you're actually picturing the events, the characters and the locations. Like you it's so cool that you just say these things and then everyone is like picturing them as a group. I think like the I really love things that are immersive and like it's so hard to get like more immersive than this.
I know for me that immersion really hits home when my characters start making decisions without my approval.
Mm-hmm.
There are times when you're acting the role of a character, but at a certain point, you just know this would upset them, or they're attracted to this person, or they really want that item. And as a player, you're like, I don't want this item. Why am I making such a big deal out of it?
Mm-hmm.
You know your character wants it. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting to just kind of lose yourself entirely in those moments.
Yeah, one of my friends, he does this voice where he's a goblin, so he'll always do this voice that's like really high pitched, and he sounds like, "Hey guys, it's me." And like sometimes he'll just do it, and like he forgets he's doing it, and then he'll realize, and we'll all start laughing, and it's like, oh my god.
Yes, when you start like reporting your dice rolls in your character's accent, you're like, oh, that shouldn't have been in character, but now it is.
Yeah.
Do you have like a favorite story or moment that you would like to share?
One of them was like a story from like an old campaign where it's this group of my friends, they end up making it through like all these monsters and all these bad guys and like all these traps to like the very end. And it's been some pretty tough fights, and they're all like sneaking up to try and get to the evil guy's lair. And one of my friends is playing a rogue, and he has this invisibility potion. So he's trying to like get this sneak attack on the guy, and he rolls his stealth check, and he gets a natural one. And so he just makes this loud noise and just like steps on like he just like falls over, and there's this loud thud. And so immediately, the guy like turns towards where he heard the sound. And so my friend, he does something that's like accidentally brilliant. He steps out of these like stalagmites that they were hiding behind, and he says, "Hey, I'm here," and then he just starts dancing to distract the guy. Nice. While his friend gets another stealth check, and it's like, oh my god, I didn't think this was how you guys are gonna beat this boss, but yeah, it was enough, and like they ended up one-shotting him, and I was like, all right, that happened. Yeah. It was very Guardians of the Galaxy-esque.
Yes, and I love that your story that you default go to is not one of instant success. Like, D&D gives you the opportunity to fail in a safe setting and turn those failures into something way more beautiful. So if any listeners don't know, most of your successes and failures you roll a 20-sided dice for, and the higher it is on that dice, the more successful your outcome. So when Joseph says a natural one, basically the person did as poorly as they could possibly do, but that doesn't always mean that it's over. I don't know, it's like one of those life lesson things where it's like, just turn it into something. It's more interesting to fail and then have your friends bail you out of it and find a way to make it succeed than it is to just do well right off the bat.
Yeah, exactly. Like the dice do a really good job of building stakes.
Exactly. Were there any things that you like really felt like you wanted to highlight about the system or your experiences with it?
Yeah, I think like there's a lot of things that can be talked about that make D&D amazing. I think for one thing, there's a lot of lore behind D&D. Like it isn't just like a set of rules to follow. It has like a really rich history of lore that you can incorporate like as much or as little of that into your game. And I've spent like a lot of time just like learning different like pieces of lore and like watching videos on them. Sometimes like with the intent of throwing them in my campaigns, but sometimes just because like some of the lore is really cool. Like I really like things like the Blood War, where it's just like this nonstop war between like demons and devils, and if one side ever gets more power, there's this theory that they'll wipe the other out, and then they'll just have enough free time to like take over all the other planes. And so it's like this balancing thing of like they can't ever have one side win or else the whole universe collapses. I just really love like just like the fact that their lore is so deep, and it's like it's not just a set of rules, it's also like a story. Like there's these things called like it was something lots, and basically they're like these creatures that you can hire and make deals with, and like whereas devils you can make deals with, but they're like lawful evil. These ones are just neutral evil, so they're really greedy, and like basically if you have enough money or enough like wealth, you can like hire these things. It's kind of a spoiler, but one of them actually shows up in one episode of the campaign, and like it was so much fun to like role play that, because you have these like super powerful creatures who are like they in terms of like challenge rating, I think they're meant for like people who are like around like level 17. So yeah, they're super powerful, and yeah, that's just another piece of lore that I love from like the universe.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I've never heard about them before. Wow, there's a lot out there.
Can we talk about any like other like number of things? Because there are other things about D&D that I love. I think one of them is also dungeon mastering in general. Yeah, so basically dungeon mastering, if you are the dungeon master, you're sort of like the game runner. You're the person who's like running the story, and you're in charge of making sure it doesn't completely fall apart and making sure that it's challenging, rewarding, and also won't kill your players every 2 seconds, because as a dungeon master you have a lot of power. Like there's a lot of powerful creatures that you could just throw at your players for no reason, but you sort of try and balance things out so that it's fun for everyone. And yeah, it's really cool to dungeon master and to sort of build up all these dungeons and like locations for your players to explore, because instead of being the one who's actually solving the problems, you get to create the problems and see how your friends solve it, which means like if the players are like thinking out a problem, you just sort of get to sit back and listen to their thought process and listen to them think out and to sort of freak out about like what you have planned for them.
Yes.
Because whenever I'm like making these like dungeons and like trying to think out how things will work, I overthink it and I think, oh, okay, they're gonna do this. Are they really gonna be able to figure this out? And it's like, worst comes to worst, they're just gonna try and smash whatever you put in front of them.
Yeah.
So they'll figure out a way somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. My default is definitely a warrior type. So if I can't, I will solve the problem with a sword one way or another.
Yes, there's always a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely a cool experience and different from playing the actual game. And then like another thing about DMing is like improvisation. Like everyone improvises when you play D&D, but as a DM, your improvisation sort of comes in the form of like seeing something take place that you weren't necessarily planning for. Like when your players don't realize that you didn't take like an hour to like plan out this NPC or this location that you just thought of in a couple seconds, it's so rewarding to be like, haha, you have no idea.
Yeah.
And you'll never know.
I will say one thing I found that'll stop most DMs dead in their tracks is when you finally ask for the NPC's name.
Oh my god, I'm awful at that.
Nobody likes naming NPCs on the spot, but I guarantee if you give them one beforehand, the players never bother asking for it.
It's so frustrating. It's like I'm terrible at names. Like I think if you like if you listen to the podcast, and I'm kind of hesitant to release the secret, but like if someone once it gets to like naming one of the NPCs, you can probably hear me stutter and be like, Jeff, like.
Have not noticed so far. All of your characters sounded like they were planned out and intentional. So I'll look for it in later episodes, though.
Yeah. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't too.
Who knows? So I would say, like, anybody who is curious about joining or checking it out, there's a lot of online communities where if you just Google search like D&D role playing, you can say, hey, I'm new to this, can I check it out? And it's the kind of community that's almost always going to say yes.
Yeah, and that's another cool thing about D&D is like there's a pretty good community around it. Like it's like I've on a lot of Reddit threads, and like especially a lot of D&D Reddit threads, and I even like advertise the podcast on a lot of them, and they're pretty supportive of a lot of things of D&D, and like you could ask them questions, and like there is so many people who like they really know like the rules and they really know D&D, and so they're like a lot of creative people, and like it has this like huge community of people that are pretty supportive.
Yeah. Now, if somebody did want to try playing D&D with their friends, and none of them have played before, do you have a suggestion for where they should start?
I think if you're trying to start out, if you're the dungeon master, I do think actually listening to like podcasts or like things of the sort really helps to like see, oh, this is like how you do it. But even if you don't do that, I think just looking at like the rules, I know a lot of people will recommend buying the player's handbook, and that definitely does help. But there are basic rules that you can look up like online that are free to use for D&D. Besides that, in general, you don't even have to worry too much about the rules. You'll definitely want to like get like the basics of like, you roll a d20 and like knowing how skills work. But I think if you want to try it, you definitely should. And I think the rules are sort of like a secondary thing. Like, you can go in, and as long as everyone's having fun, I think you're playing the game right.
That's a really good point. A lot of tables have what they call house rules, which is basically we find it more interesting and fun to play it this way, so we're just gonna change this rule to fit our style.
Yeah.
Start where it interests you, and then build your repertoire.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there are different versions of D&D out there. I believe they're on 5th edition currently.
Mm-hmm.
What do you actually play with your gaming tables?
Yeah, so I've only played like in terms of D&D, I've only played the 5th edition. That's like being like that Critical Role brought me into it. That's the only version I've tried. I'd like to try like some of the older ones. I had an idea that at one point that maybe at some point I'll do like a one shot for like the podcast in like another edition. I think that might be fun. I've heard good things about. Well, I've heard a lot of things about different editions. But in general, a lot of people seem to like 3.5.
That's what I played.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. That was the newest edition when I was playing.
Ooh, cool. Yeah. I mean, I definitely would love to hear if that's okay. Like, what were your thoughts on 3.5? Especially, I don't know if you've... I believe you said you haven't played 5th edition, right? Or
correct.
Have you?
I've not played 4th or 5th. I mean, when I was playing 3.5, that was all I knew, so I loved it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the system itself was pretty straightforward, but I think it's really the people and the stories that you decide to do with it. Like, I don't know, there isn't a bad system if you have the right friends.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely like in general, not just D&D, the RPG games, they're definitely like a really cool experience and like definitely something cool to try out.
Yeah.
When I first started going in, I didn't think it would be like so much a part of like me. Going in, I was just sort of like, this will be fun to try out maybe like once or twice, and now like it's been like a year or so, maybe more, and like it's still like a part of like, if someone asks like my hobbies, I'm like, oh, D&D, like yeah, like it's just so much fun, and like it's so cool to like be a part of the community in general.
Yeah. And I think, like, speaking to that, it is also the sort of thing that a lot of people who try playing it, you want to play more. It's fun. It's fun to let your guard down. It's fun to just try other things. It's fun to be in an environment where you can argue with people and you're not actually mad at them. You can solve puzzles and feel like you're really smart. You can, like, it gives you a chance to try different things and feel like you're accomplishing things in a safe setting.
And yeah, I really agree with that. That you really want more of it. Like I've played like a lot of D&D with my friends, and like sometimes it does get to the point where it's like, oh my god, we played so much D&D, let's take a break. But then like inevitably that D&D feeling of like wanting to play just like creeps in, and you're like, hey, let's do another game of D&D.
Yeah,
it's something that's like hard to be sick of. It's always like every once in a while, it's always fun to get the dice out and play.
That's excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary of D&D. Are there any final conclusions or anything that you're like, oh, I meant to get to this and I didn't have the chance to, anything like that?
I think probably one thing that I'll touch on, just because like I think this is also kind of like a big part of like playing D&D, is like a session zeros, which like is basically you get together with whoever you're gonna play with, and you sort of flesh out like the rules, or like any homebrew rules. You talk about like the setting, and you give them like an idea of what they're getting into, and they can talk about their characters, and you can help them make their characters, and you sort of like just make sure that like everyone's on the same page essentially. I really like that. I think that's just something that like if you give the players information about your world, they'll use it. And like for the podcast, like I gave like I got to run D&D with like some other podcasters, and we recorded it, and I got to tell them like about the world, and then like they came back and they had like all these cool ideas, which a lot of them now like are canon into like the campaign. And it's like in general the players will like run with whatever you give them, and they'll like make it into something even bigger, which is really what makes it a cooperative storytelling experience.
Yeah, outside of game is just as important as inside of game, both in developing your world and talking about what you want your character to be, and the things you want to see happen.
And in general, I think that's most everything to, like, obviously it's impossible to cover everything about D&D, and this is sort of just mostly the things that are like on the top of my mind. But yeah, that's for the most part everything I wanted to cover about D&D.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for your time. And again, your podcast is Bulldogs and Dragons, Milestone Academy. If you enjoyed hearing about D&D, you will definitely enjoy hearing Joseph and his friends play D&D. Their system or setting that they're putting out is interesting, fun, and I think it actually really appeals to people who might not know all of the like deep stuff, because the characters are learning, you can learn along with them.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the plug. And I mean, I've really enjoyed. You don't have to twist my leg very hard for me to want to talk about D&D.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
Speaking of which, if people are interested in looking into you, I know I've plugged your podcast a few times, but is there a specific way that you'd recommend them, like, reaching out, following you?
Yeah, we're on Twitter at Bulldogs Dragons. I'm dumb for not taking like an N and putting it in there like Bulldogs and Dragons, but yeah, that's our Twitter now, Bulldogs Dragons.
Perfect. If you're interested in following me, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as The Turtle Stack. If you have something you want to chat about, please email theturtlestack@gmail.com. I don't need an expert, just someone who enjoys something, no matter how simple or eccentric. If you're excited to talk about it, I'm excited to listen. Just remember the rules. No slamming, no selling. Thanks for listening.